This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you so much for joining us again for a new special episode of Beyond the Big Screen. Today, we are joined by Shane Gilfoyle of the History of Hockey podcast to discuss hockey in the Olympics, particularly one of the most important and exciting times in U.S. Olympic hockey history, the famous Miracle on Ice team of the 1980 Olympics in Lake Placid, New York, USA. We will be using the 2004 movie Miracle as a lens and jumping off point to discuss this fascinating time in sports history. Depending on when you are listening to this, the 2018 Olympics in Pyeongchang, South Korea are still going on or just wrapped up. So I hope this will contextualize Olympic hockey a bit more. Thank you so much for coming on today, Shane.
Steve, thank you so much for having me. This is really an honor, truly. I mean that. Thank you.
I'm really excited to dive into it. It's a great story, and you have a really great podcast detailing the history. I love the history of sports. There's just so much there.
There really is. I kind of feel like there's almost not enough of it out there. It's kind of something that people maybe don't think about. There's the history of warfare and all of that really juicy stuff, but sports kind of seem to fall by the wayside. So.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself and your interesting backstory on how you got yourself interested in hockey and starting a hockey podcast.
Yeah, I'd love to. Originally, I'm from Colorado. I grew up in a little town of about 5,000 people, 2 or 3 roads, only one of which was paved. That was in central-ish Colorado, and kind of up in the mountains a little bit, so it was always cold, always snowy, and I spent my winters there with my mom, my older brother, and I really owe a lot of my love for hockey to my mom, which is kind of funny because she's never, ever been a sports person, but she saw that I liked it and really encouraged me to do it. And we would sit down and watch games. And my neighbor actually had an NHL sports package, and he would let us come over and watch the games. And, growing up playing myself, we had about 2 sheets of ice. One was really, really big. You could fit tons and tons of kids on it. And then one was about the size of a modern day, just one zone of a hockey rink. And so, one was really big, one was small, and both, I was so lucky, they were very, very nearby. And so my brother and I would go out there, and he's older, so I would cry more often than he would about getting cold. And I'd come home crying, swearing I'd never go back. And then, the toes would thaw and the hands would thaw, and I'd warm back up. And then sure enough, the next day I'd be right back out there. And as far as, my love for professional hockey, I was a Mighty Ducks of Anaheim kid. I grew up with those movies. And then when the team started in Anaheim, I was all about that. I even have one of the old starter jackets that were the hot thing back in the early 90s. And, and part of my love for that was that we didn't have a team of our own in Colorado. And that all changed in 1995 when ComSat bought the Quebec Nordiques and moved them to Denver. And it was all of a sudden I had my own team, and I really liked all of the players. And I always fancied goalies too. And then December of that year rolled around, and we got a guy by the name of Patrick Waugh from the Montreal Canadiens. And his arrival I liked the team already, but his arrival made me truly, truly fall in love with with that team. And I mean, the rivalry between them and the Detroit Red Wings in that era was just second to none. I mean, it was so much fun to watch. And I mean, you could pretty much count on whichever one of those teams emerged from the playoffs was going to win the cup. And so that was always very nice to have. Growing up, my parents were divorced. My dad always lived in Ohio. In fact, my entire family, both sides, are from Ohio. It just so happened that when they split, my mom moved to Colorado when I was really young and, in kindergarten, and then I grew up out there. My dad stayed here. Well, I would spend summers here. So I'm just as much an Ohio kid as I am a Colorado kid. And we would go to the Eastern Coast Hockey League that was in town by the name of the Columbus Chill. And anybody from Central Ohio remembers hockey back in those days, remembers the Columbus Chill. They were so far ahead of their time and so much fun to watch. And what I mean by ahead of their time is their in-game antics that got the crowd involved and their promotions and just all of the fun stuff that they would do. They're still missed in Columbus to this day. I think if this town could support the local NHL team and the Columbus Chill, many people would have them back. I'm certain of it. And then the success of the Columbus Chill led to the NHL expanding in Columbus, Ohio on June 25th, 1997. And that brought a team called the Columbus Blue Jackets to town. And I was still very young, still very impressionable. And so now my dad lives just a stone's throw north of downtown. And so all of a sudden I've got another NHL team right down the street from my house. And they were terrible. They were the absolute antithesis of the Colorado Avalanche. The Avalanche were winning division titles, winning cups. They were kicking butt every single year. And then the Blue Jackets were the opposite of that. But it really didn't matter because they were from my town and I absolutely loved them. And even to this day, really, I feel, just despite the divorce and all the stuff that comes from growing up in a split home, I feel very lucky to be from two places, both of which have NHL hockey and both of these teams that I absolutely love. So in June of 2015, I started a podcast. I've always liked history. I've always had fantastic history teachers, most notably my 7th and 8th grade teacher, who he told stories in such a fascinating way that it was so clear that he enjoyed the story he was telling. He wasn't just reciting chapter and verse and all of that stuff. He was so very much into it, and that just came out in his teaching, and that really made me fall in love with history, and so I always liked hockey, and so I started thinking, maybe all these people are doing podcasts but there's not one about hockey history out there. Nobody's doing it, and very similar to Ray Harris Jr. of the World War II podcast, whose show I believe you've been on, and Mike Duncan of History of Rome and Revolutions. They created their podcasts because that's what they wanted to hear. Nobody was doing a World War II podcast, and Ray finally was like, you know what, I'll do it myself. And that's where I got to with hockey. I waited a couple years for somebody to come out with this thing, and nobody did. So I was like, all right, well, I like hockey, I like history, I'll put the two together. I got some encouragement from my wife. Funny enough, when I was saying some things about the local team, the Blue Jackets, about what they should be doing with their team, and then she heard something very similar about a week later on the radio, and she said, I heard exactly what you were saying, and they were talking about it on the radio. Maybe this podcast isn't such a bad idea. So I did it, and now here I am a few years later, and she, I think she kind of regrets it because it takes up a lot of my time. But she lets me do it, and I love her for that.
Yeah, that's really cool. Let's dive right into this whole era. This movie places us at one particular point in 1980 Olympics, but there's a lot of backstory to this event, the Miracle on Ice. What were some of the events that led up to this momentous point in hockey history? From my understanding is Team USA hockey always wasn't really the best team, and they were coming into this Olympics as somewhat of underdogs.
Yeah, very much. In fact, they stated numerous times that really their only goal was to not be embarrassed. They didn't really have intention of winning a gold medal. They definitely wanted to win a medal, but they just didn't want to be embarrassed. They knew that the Soviet team was the greatest team in the world, and going toe to toe with them, it's going to be tough. So they just wanted to show up and say, okay, we kind of belong here too. So they had their success. By no means the success that the Russians had or anything like that, or Canada. But they did win a gold medal back in 1960, which it's sometimes called the forgotten miracle because it was pretty miraculous in its own right. But by and large, they weren't that great.
We have, going into this Olympics, we have Team USA, Team Canada, Team Soviet Union, and then the European teams. They all played different styles of hockey. How did that kind of break down in the different ways these regions were playing hockey at that time?
Yeah, by and large, from the time hockey systems were really invented and implemented, and you see this nowhere more prevalent than in North America, is players sticking to their lanes, so to speak. And for anyone who doesn't know what a lane is, you divide the sheet of ice going north to south, goal to goal, into thirds: a right side, a center, and a left side. And it was very, very typical for the forwards to stay in their lane and to not get very creative. And whoever had the puck on their stick, it was about them. It was a little too individualistic. And the preferred method through all of North America was the dump and chase. And that would be a player with the puck, instead of carrying the puck into the zone on his stick, would throw it in at the red line, the halfway mark of the ice, or the blue line if they could get it a little bit farther. And then the strategy from that point was to rush into the zone. Now you don't have the puck. Now it's anybody's puck to get, but you try to beat your opponent there to regain control of the puck. And if you're successful in doing that, you then have the puck much lower in the zone, and that's where you want to be. That's where you can make plays happen. The problem with that is you might not end up with the puck, and that is what made the Soviets so very different. Is they didn't do the dump and chase. They had all five guys working together, and they believed very, very strongly that every one of them had to touch the puck. Before a shot would go off their stick, every one of them would be touching the puck. And their passing was just so crisp and so clean and so perfect that nobody could really stop them. And they would carry the puck into the zone. as opposed to dumping and chasing. They just, I mean, they really kind of rewrote how to play hockey.
Would I be going too far in saying that North American hockey was in a way inferior to the Soviet game?
I don't think you're going too far at all, because it's the game that we play today is largely because of what the Soviets did. So I don't think that's a stretch. I don't think it's too far at all, no.
Is it accurate to call a North American game? Did the U.S. and Canada pretty much play by the same strategy?
Yes, but with Canada's only focus being on hockey, they were just much better at it than we ever were.
Let's talk a little bit about, before we dive into we're going to talk a lot about Team USA, but obviously the other major player in this was the Soviet team. Maybe we could discuss a little bit about how the Soviet team was organized, because it was very different than the way the U.S. team and other teams were organized, and a little bit more about their style of play. So let's focus in first. How was that team, their Olympic team, organized?
Well, I can go back quite a ways if you like. Okay. We talked a little bit about this before we started recording in our correspondence. And I don't know a ton about the politics behind all of this and everything, but when the Soviets came to power during World War I and the Russians pulled out of the war, and then they took over the country, they, as I understand it, they really withdrew from sports, from the spotlight and that sort of thing. They really saw it as something that capitalists did. It was something that just it wasn't their speed. It was all about just one guy. It was too much on the individual. It wasn't on the collective like they were believing. Then World War II comes around, and they beat arguably the greatest army to ever march the earth, the Nazi Germany. And then they start to think, well, all right, so if we beat this unbeatable machine in war, maybe we start reconsidering this hockey thing, or sporting in general. And there's a history to them playing hockey. Tsar Alexander III played in the 1800s as a child, and truly what style of hockey was it? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. But there are records and proof of him playing ice hockey. And so World War II comes around, they beat the Nazis, and they start to think that, okay, maybe this sports thing is another way that we can show that communism is the way that everyone should be living their life. If we can develop a sports program, the peak of which would be hockey, if we can develop that and really dominate, well, then we're going to be the best, and that'll be our proof. So the government sets about doing that, and they hire a guy by the name of Anatoly Tarasov. Now This is how crazy some things work sometimes. Tarasov did not have any hockey background. In fact, he was a watchmaker. And it was said later that maybe the reason he was able to get 5 ice hockey players to work so well together is because he knew the inner workings of wristwatches so well and pocket watches so well. So the government hires Tarasov, and he had, excuse me, I keep burping in everybody's ear. He goes to the United Kingdom, sees a hockey game, and he falls in love with it. And he says, yeah, I think I can do this. But here's what I need from you guys, the Soviet government. Get me film footage of English hockey, Canadian hockey, American hockey. Get me the footage. I need it to to build this program. And they said no. They said, we think that you will do a better job if you have no reference point. Learn the rules, we'll get you the books, whatever. But build a completely new style of hockey. Don't have any reference point to this stuff that we want to defeat. And so he did that. And for as crazy as it sounds, to think that you can build a winning program with no reference material, Tarasov did it. And I think he was truly brilliant. And so he really was the father of Russian hockey. And he saw it as a team sport. Like I said, he was a watchmaker. He saw all of these tiny little pieces working together. And he thought, well, why can't I make these men, these skaters, do the exact same thing? And when he saw a blank sheet of ice, all he saw was possibility. Possibility for new things that had just never been tried. And he was like a painter with a blank canvas. And he saw that crystal white sheet of ice, and he saw nothing but possibility. And he wrote incessantly. I mean, I think he published over 40 books. His daughter Tatiana would report that he would just retreat into his study and write and all of this stuff. And he was just a brilliant guy. So he sees them, these players, and the sport of hockey as something that has to be done as a team. He even said after seeing the great Bobby Hull play, he said, one Bobby Hull against one of our boys, Bobby Hull will win every single time. Two Bobby Hulls against two of our boys that I'm going to build, maybe the Hulls win, but I might put a little bit of my money on our two. You get 5 guys on the ice, 5 Bobby Hulls and 5 Russians. He said, I will take our boys all day and all night. And his reasoning behind that his theory behind that is because the North American style was he saw it as so much about just the one player with the puck that a group of all-stars could not defeat a true team, a true group of guys, 5 guys working together. And so that's what he set out to do. He was all about camaraderie and just being team oriented. He loved his players, and in fact, once the program started going, and there was a new recruit coming into the team, he would let the existing members of the team vote on whether or not this new guy was good enough and had the right personality to play with them. Now, I've just never heard of that. So I think that's a really innovative way to go about things. His style of hockey was finesse and speed and artistry. And the North American style, it was not that there weren't finesse players. I'm sure we've all heard of a guy named Bobby Orr, but I feel like that he was the exception to the rule. It was very, you've got teams like the Broad Street Bullies, the Philadelphia Flyers of the mid-'70s, just beating the holy crap out of everything that moved and winning 2 cups because of it. So now in today's game, we don't really have those bashing, brawling teams anymore. We have finesse teams, and I mean, you look at a team like the Pittsburgh Penguins, and they just, I mean, they can just do some really miraculous things with their skill, and I feel like that a lot of that is owed to the Soviet system.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Yeah, it makes me think from like a slice of when I first started watching hockey, in maybe the early 80s to the 90s, when the first time watching hockey, you would just basically, like, the first game of the playoffs, the two teams would fight, beat the crap out of each other. There'd be like 4 people in each penalty box. And then Alexander Mogilny started, and it was like a different game within like a year or two. And he's one of the first Russian hockey players. I'm sure we're going to get into this a little bit at the end of the episode, but these Russian players really changed the game.
Truly. I mean, they came over, and once the curtain fell. Now Alexander Mogilny actually defected, but yeah, I mean, once they came over and they started infusing their style into the North American game, it changed everything. You look at a team like the Detroit Red Wings of the mid to late 90s, and how, I mean, they won their cups on the backs of the Russian Five, and their creativity really came from drilling so hard and so often. They knew everywhere they were supposed to be, and from that immense preparation, they were able to be extremely creative. And at one point, I'm forgetting who said it now, but of Russian players, Igor Larionov and Vladimir Krutov, they understood their roles so well that, and they worked together so well, that all of that preparation led to brilliant improvisation. And this quote, again, by, I'm forgetting who said it, but said that they could fool 9 players at once. They could fool every player on the opposition, and they could fool their own team. Like, even their own team didn't know what they were going to do, because they were just so well prepared. And when that came over here, I mean, it changed everything.
The Soviet team was organized in a little bit different way than the USA team and Team Canada, in that these players, even though they weren't officially professionals, Olympic hockey was really their job. How is that different between, say, Team USA?
Truly, yes. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. The Russians were amateurs only on paper. Like you said, their job was to play hockey. On paper, I'm a soldier, I'm a student, I do this, I do that. But really, 11 months out of the year, they were training in hockey. They got, if they were lucky, they got a weekend off a month, and the rest of that time they were playing hockey or training for hockey, and that includes the summer. Anatoly Tarasov, when the ice would melt, he didn't want to stop practicing, so he developed an entire system for practicing in the summer. And I've seen some footage of their summer camps, and it is brutal. Just dead man carries up flights of stairs and running into trees to toughen up their bodies. I mean, just crazy stuff. But so around the clock, these guys really are professional hockey players. You go to the North American side of things, and Team USA in particular, they actually were students. They were from college. You couldn't be a professional in and then participate in the Olympics. And numerous times, players would quote unquote ruin their eligibility by signing a professional contract. And once that name, as soon as you have accepted one dime from the National Hockey League, that's it. You're not an amateur anymore. And that's what's truly remarkable about this U.S. team, is that they were amateurs in the truest sense, against a group of absolutely seasoned professionals that had, some of them had been playing together for 10, 15 years by the time Miracle on Ice happened.
The coach of that team was a guy named Herb Brooks, and the story of how he became the coach is fascinating. Then maybe we can transition into how very much different this team was than the Soviet team. But let's first just talk about how was Herb Brooks picked to be the coach of this Team USA Olympic hockey team?
Well, it's now, 37, 38 years later, we can look at Herb and say, not even question that he was ever not going to be the coach. He's the guy who led them to glory. He was a genius, but he was absolutely not the A-House's first choice. So the A-House is the Amateur Hockey Association of the United States before they became USA Hockey. He wasn't their first choice. He wasn't even their second choice. He was their third choice. Their first choice was a guy by the name of Bill Cleary, who, in a sort of roundabout way, nothing malicious, but he was in a way responsible for Herb Brooks not being on as a player the 1960 USA gold medal winning team, because he had left the team and the administration wanted him back. And he said, okay, I'll come back, but only if my brother Bob can come play as well. They said, okay, fine. Oh, by the way, Herb, hit the bricks, buddy, you're done. And so he got cut from the 1960 team. And just a few days later, he was sitting in his living room with his dad, watching his buddies and his country win gold without him. And so the A-House, they go straight to Bill Cleary. They say, hey, we want you to coach our team. And he wasn't up for it. He didn't want to do it. And they go, okay, well, on to the next one then. Their second choice didn't want to do it. And I'm not saying that Herb Brooks was a reluctant choice, but he was not their first choice. So they call him in. He interviews for the job, and he is so well prepared that he basically blows the socks off the committee. He had diagrams and graphs and posters and all of this stuff that he wanted to do. And through the novel idea that we should abandon the way we play hockey. And if we really want to do something, we should try and play like Russia. And it was because of that just enormous amount of preparation on Herb's part that he did end up getting the job.
Now let's talk a little bit about this team, because the team, like you said, they were true amateurs. They were almost all college students. How was this team put together?
There was a tryout, more or less, in Colorado Springs, which I actually know right. I know right where the Olympic Committee's building is, right down in downtown Colorado Springs. So there's tryouts at the on the ice, and for about a period of 2 weeks, the Herb and assistant coach Craig Patrick and Walter Bush, who's high up in A-House, they're looking at the players, and they're figuring out who they want. And Herb gives everybody a psychological battery, a test. It's 300 questions, and that helps him weed out all of the people who he believes will not be able to handle what he has in store for the team. So they kind of decide, a little bit on that, and it's funny, Jim Craig. It is mentioned in the movie. Jim Craig, the goaltender, he actually doesn't take the test. In the movie, he never takes it, but in real life, he actually did refuse to take it. Said he didn't see the point. He thought it was stupid. But then just a couple days later, he actually does end up taking it. And so really, again, the purpose of that test was just to figure out if these guys can stand up to what he's about to throw at them for the next year because they, if they're not going to be ready, then they don't belong on his team.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. One thing that I found interesting about this team, and they spoke a little bit about it in the movie, and in your notes you mentioned it, this is not, if you look through the roster of the team, none of these guys are going to shoot out in your face like, wow, these are some of the greatest NHL players of all time. There's some players such as Mike Ramsey who made a solid career, but some of the other people didn't even play NHL hockey. What was kind of the talent level of this team?
They were talented, but they weren't Russians. I think 13 of the 20 guys did end up going on to play at least some in the NHL. Kenny Morrow played for the dynastic New York Islanders. In fact, he won just 4 months after winning gold medal. He won his first Stanley Cup with the New York Islanders, and then they went on to win 3 more in a row. So the talent was there, but what Herb was looking for was not, and they say this in the movie, and this is an actual quote from Herb, is he says something to the effect of that he is not looking for the most talented players. He's looking for the right players, the correct players. And what he meant by that is he needed the correct players mentally. And that goes back to the psychological battery. He needed to know that these were the guys that he could mold in his image and basically rebuild them as hockey players. They needed to be able to forget the type of hockey that they had played thus far. And they needed to forget it because that's not what he was teaching and that's not what was going to work. So he picked these guys that he felt he could shape to his needs, and that's largely what he found, and clearly it worked.
We're skipping ahead a little bit here, but at the end of the movie, Kurt Russell, playing Herb Brooks, gives a little bit of a monologue, and he says how his team was an amateur team, and in future Olympics, they would have professionals. And I'm wondering, do you think that if Herb Brooks could have gotten his hands on the creme de la creme of NHL players, that he could have made a better team out of it, or that his style of training, that these guys who were professionals, he could have never gotten them gelled into a team in that amount of time?
I love that question, and I don't think that he could have. As brilliant as he was, there comes a point in a player's life where, not so much in a disrespecting sort of way, but just in a, I'm a man, I am a professional hockey player, let me play, you're the coach. A lot of professional athletes get into that headspace. And to take a group of the like you said, the creme de la creme, and mold them in that short amount of time, I don't think it would have worked, because you're asking them to forget every reason that got them into the professional leagues. Like that's not going to work. In 1998, when professionals were finally allowed in the Olympics, it was a terrible move for, on Team USA's part. I remember being so disappointed, but I think for Herb's needs, it just wouldn't have worked. And then, and he coached the 2002 Team USA in Salt Lake City as well. And he coached him to a silver medal, and that's a terrific accomplishment. But I just don't know what he could have done against the Russians other than what he did. I think he had the perfect plan.
Now, let's talk about this plan. Much of the movie is really the training of this team. What were some of the things that Herb Brooks did to take these players who were predominantly from either the Minnesota area or the Massachusetts area. Very different players. What did he do to meld them together as a cohesive team? A lot of these players even came in with animosities to each other before they even stepped on the ice as a team.
Oh, for sure. In the I think it was 1976 playoffs, the Minnesota Golden Gophers and the Boston Terriers played each other in the NCAA playoffs, and there was a big brawl, and Boston lost a key piece to their lineup, and as a result of that, Minnesota ended up winning the game, going on to win the national championship. And Boston really did hold it against Minnesota for a long time. And so when you've got these two rival factions who are now supposed to play together and be on the same team under one banner, Herb knew that they weren't going anywhere if they just hated each other. So what he did was he made himself the enemy. He gave them a common thing to hate, and a lot of them really did hate him. But then in later years, they go back and they like, you know what? I get it. I don't think that I would have done it any other way, because it was another one of those things that worked. So he is enemy number one from day one, and he puts his assistant coach Craig Patrick as kind of like almost like team mom, you know. Hey, if you have a problem, go talk to Craig. I'm not your friend. He even says, I'm your coach. I'm not your friend. So he kind of leaves Craig on mop up duty, and he just makes these guys hate him, and he makes them hate him by just tearing them down and building them back up and drilling them incessantly and really understanding what buttons to push and when to push them. Calling somebody out when he wants to prove a point. Great example, Jack O'Callahan, defenseman. He pulled Jack aside and he says, I'm going to use you for something, and I'm using you because I know that you can take it. He says, when I call you OC, short for O'Callahan, I'm gonna tear you apart. When I call you OC, I am gonna lay into you. But I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to everybody. I'm using you so that they learn. And I'm doing this because I know you can take it. When I address you as Jack, then I am talking to you, Jack O'Callahan. That's something you need to work on. And so he just knew how to get to people. He played mind games from day one, and it just I keep saying the phrase "it worked" a lot, but it did. It worked out.
What do we know about Herb Brooks? We know that he was cut from that 1960 team. What else made him so hungry to beat the Soviet team and win those Olympics?
He wanted to prove that he could do it. And I mean, I guess that's not saying a lot. Everybody wants to prove that they could do it. But when he was sitting on his floor by his dad, watching the 1960 Team USA skate with the gold medal, and he wasn't a part of it, his dad says, well, I guess they cut the right guy. Meaning, sorry, Herb, but they were right to cut you. And today we can't imagine someone saying something like that. That's a rough thing to say to your. I think Herb was 21 at the time. That's a rough thing to say to your kid. But Herb, he was not upset. He just knew at his innermost point, whatever that was, that his dad was correct. And so he actually used that as motivation for the rest of his life. He wanted to prove that he was the right guy for that job. And he believed what his dad said so thoroughly that he went up to the 1960 gold medal winning head coach, Jack Riley, after they got back. And instead of, some snotty kid being like, oh, I wish you guys had lost, I can't believe you cut me, he goes, Jack, you cut the right guy. And I mean, that tells you how humbled he was by that experience, that he wasn't a part of it, but he was happy for his team. And he says when he's the coach of the 80 Olympics team that the name on the front is more important than a name on the back. The name on the back doesn't mean a thing. And so he just used what his dad said as motivation for the rest of his life.
What was Herb Brooks doing before he was selected to be the coach of this team?
He was coaching at Minnesota. He was the Golden Gophers coach, and he was actually coaching during the famed hockey fight called the Bloodbath between in the 76 playoffs between the Boston Terriers and the Minnesota Golden Gophers, and so yeah, he was coaching there, and he had started implementing his ideas of what he wanted Team USA to be in his college team. And so he had proof positive that what he wanted was already working, because he was already trying it with University of Minnesota kids, and they were responding.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. A huge thanks goes out to Shane Gilfoyle of the History of Hockey podcast for joining us today. Links to learn more about Shane and the history of hockey can be found by searching the History of Hockey on iTunes, Stitcher, Facebook, and any other good podcatcher, or in the show notes. You can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, connect to Facebook page and Twitter feeds by going over to our website, a2zhistorypage.com. If you have ideas for future shows or guests, I'd love to hear them. And you can send me a message through good old-fashioned email at steve@a2zhistorypage.com, Facebook by searching Beyond the Big Screen, and Twitter at Big Screen Beyond. I always appreciate a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, as you well know. Ratings and reviews help me learn what you think of the show and also helps get out the word of Beyond the Big Screen to other people. This is just ending part one of a two-part episode we have with Shane, so we will definitely see you next time to finish up this great story Beyond the Big Screen.